And we are back with another episode of Gladiator for Europe. I am Liam, your host for this evening, here with Sam B.
Hello there.
And a really special guest we're so excited to have on, Brendan Yukon Cornelius at Needle's Eye with 3 E's. Welcome to the pod.
Very, very glad to be here.
You know so much about left-wing politics, especially in the years between World War I and World War II. So as soon as we first embarked on this interwar series, we knew that you'd be a great guest to bring on. Before we really get started in this episode, which is going to be about the legacy of the socialist revolutions of the early 1920s, late 1910s, which mostly failed, can you tell a little bit about your background, your interests in this period, and in left-wing politics and organizing?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I've always been really, really interested in history. I was reading academic history regularly. I think by the time I was probably 14 or 15.
Oh, wow.
I was not, journal articles, but, in terms of books and whatever. And, I was also becoming interested in left-wing politics at that time, but those interests were sort of loosely connected. I can remember reading a couple of books when I was a teenager about, or that dealt with, to some, significant extent, communists in the United States fighting against segregation. And that sort of twigged something in my mind that, maybe these people weren't the bad guys. They had illusions, in the Soviet Union and whatnot, but they were trying to do positive things that nobody else was interested in.
You've read Hammer and Hoe, right? By Robin Kelly?
Yeah. Or it wasn't Hammer and Hoe. It was actually this book called Defying Dixie by a historian named Glenda Elizabeth Gilmore. And it's not just about the CPUSA, which Hammer and Hoe is. It's sort of about the popular front left in the South in a broader sense. And then, sort of in my, by the time I finished high school, I had become basically convinced of revolutionary socialism, and I joined the youth organization of the Communist Party of Canada when I started university. That's it's tied to the 100-year-old Communist Party of Canada. So there's definitely a historical emphasis there. People in those circles talk about the history of the party, the history of the movement a lot, and I just sort of became, and I guess I am to this day a little bit obsessed with the history of the international left. I love reading old newspapers and polemics and all of these things. And I was in sort of that place politically for several years. Now I'm sort of doing different things in socialist politics, and I've sort of broadened out my sort of historical interest and tried to sort of get a better. I think I'm interested in, and I think the only way to do this is to read the primary material, is to understand, sort of every tendency on its own terms, rather than sort of relying on what their enemies said about them.
Right. I think that you made a really good point on Twitter a while back that stuck with me, which was that a lot of differences in left-wing politics that might seem trivial at the time, or in our time might seem trivial, are really people in a certain historical moment trying to understand their moment in very specific ways that to us now, are incomprehensible, but meant a lot to them.
Yeah. And so that's something that I think is really valuable about primary material is one thing, but also sufficiently fleshed out, historical work. For the past couple of months, I've been reading a lot about the Russian Revolution, and it's just there's so many, it's so interesting and so fun to get into the flesh and blood, right, of the revolutionary process at that level.
And I think that whole period of revolution, which we're going to talk about today, is so important, and I think so understudied in mainstream kind of Western circles. In high school, we learned so much about World War I and a little bit about the Bolshevik Revolution. We didn't get a peep about the revolutions in Russia or in Hungary at this time. But I think even from a primary education perspective, I think that's a mistake, because I think those revolutions, which ultimately were not able to take off, had a huge impact on the way politics would go across the 20s and 30s. With the end of World War I in 1918 and 1919, the house of European society was pretty much shaken to its foundations. Thanks to the relentless destruction meted out by the imperialist powers between themselves and among themselves, many of the rulers of this old order were destroyed, and the survivors were barely hanging on. Those who suffered the most in the previous century now had the most to gain. So you start to see communities that had previously been under the thumb of old dynasties like the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, or the Ottomans suddenly become part of these new nations carving themselves out in Europe and the Middle East. Ethnic minorities across the world, most prominently African Americans in the US and Jewish people in Central and Eastern Europe, were able to fight for new rights and a new dignity that had previously been denied. Universal suffrage for women was just over the horizon, and from both coasts of the Pacific, from Kamchatka on one side to California on the other, we see this genuinely global outbreak of working class anger that is going to set the course for a new century. At the start of 1919, Lenin said that we've never been so near to a global revolution as we are right now. And he was right. I think what Lenin didn't anticipate, though, was that this particular moment, at least in Europe, would never come again. There would never be a moment where Western and Central Europe would be so close to joining a communist world as in 1919 and 1920. And I think that because these revolutions in Europe and even the Americas did not succeed, for a lot of reasons, they were isolated, they were ill-equipped, they were ill-prepared. But even though they did not succeed, I think that they would have a lasting political and psychological impact on both the people who participated in these revolutions and maybe more importantly, in the people who played a role in destroying them. Especially because the forces that would destroy these revolutions, not only in Europe, but also in the Americas, would basically determine the course of politics in the 20s and 30s, and you could pretty convincingly argue led directly to the outbreak of World War II.
Exactly. So amid the fires of these brief revolutions, two different groups would converge to lay out a future for humanity. Most famously of the meeting of the imperialist victors who convened in Paris in 1919, the US, Britain, France.
The Versailles Conference.
Exactly, in Versailles. And the intention was to manage the destinies of the entire world. Thousands of delegates from across the planet met at the Palace of Versailles. Nationalists of every kind met to battle over maps and mythologies. Some of the famous attendees are the first Czech president, Edvard Beneš, the Irish revolutionaries Sean O'Kelly, Prince Faisal, and Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah, but we should mention that most peoples of the world were not guaranteed a seat at this table.
No.
Sort of understandably, Germany, Austria, Hungary were not invited. But beyond that, only token representation was given to India, which was, seen as part of the British delegation. Korea, all Arab people, and even China only had very limited representation, usually in the form of very pro-Western figures who could chart a future for those countries on British, French, American terms. The only black person invited was the president of Liberia at that time, and everybody else who attempted to join, if their skin was too dark, including W.E.B. Du Bois, would be stopped at the door. I'm sure you know, Brendan, that Ho Chi Minh attended.
Yes, yeah. So the future Ho Chi Minh was living in France at that time. He had left Vietnam as a young man, and he'd worked as a sailor and as he'd worked in hotels and was just sort of part of the global transient workforce.
Yeah, and supposedly he even trained to be a chef under Escoffier, who was like the father of modern French cooking.
Yeah, and then he found himself in France towards the end of the war, and he became a member of the French Socialist Party, as well as, I don't know if he had ties to any organized, Vietnamese nationalist group, but he must have, because he must have said that he was representing somebody at the conference.
Woodrow Wilson famously claimed he was all for self-determination, but when Ho Chi Minh asked for Vietnam to be released from French colonial authority, he was basically just shown the door. Because it was clear that at this high table, not everybody was invited. And I would argue that as a direct response from the pretty much discriminatory nature of the Paris Peace Conference, another convention was convened just a couple weeks after.
There's actually a really good segue to this, via the young Ho Chi Minh, because while this is going on, you have the debates in the French Socialist Party about whether they're going to join a new international. And the young Ho Chi Minh becomes one of the supporters of that position because of what the revolutionary regime in Russia is saying about colonialism. And he wrote decades later that when he had discovered Leninism, he cried because he was so moved and impacted to finally discover the path for the liberation of Vietnam and the colonial people in general.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, and it kind of connects to your mention about Southern communists, especially African-American communists in the 20s and 30s in the US, because there's so many bad things we can say about the communist legacy. the Marxist-Leninist legacy in particular, but I think it's really important to point out that in the 20s and 30s, generally speaking, the main peoples making these arguments on behalf of colonized peoples in the US and in Asia were part of the broad, were under the broad communist umbrella. These issues had not yet really been taken up by the liberal majority.
No, they'd been rejected by them, outright rejected.
Yeah. So basically, of the peoples who couldn't get a seat or were denied a seat at the high table in Versailles, there was another table in Moscow, which would be the Third Socialist International, sort of part of the same legacy of these international working men's organizations that Karl Marx had originally been part of back in the 19th century, and then the less successful Second International in the later 19th century that would be dissolved, or that would basically be dissolved because of World War I. This international conference, which would come to be known as the Comintern for Communist International, I would argue had a more important long-term impact than the Paris Peace Conference, if only because it actually produced basically a permanent institution, whereas the Versailles Conference would lead to the League of Nations, which was infamously ineffective. For decades, the Comintern would connect socialists and communists across the globe.
The architects of the League of Nations thought they could ensure global peace with a list of rulers and a lot of state dinner, but the builders of the Comintern were trying to build something entirely different. They believed they could usher in a new global era in which war would be unthinkable and impossible. They genuinely wanted to change the world.
And so looking back now, we can see that both these visions would eventually collapse. But I think that in this period of time that we're focusing this series on, the interwar years, this was a time for extreme optimism for both these camps, for the Versailles table and the Moscow table. And I think that that's why it's so interesting to look at these two different groups and maybe try to figure out why neither one of them were able to really succeed, because both their optimistic visions of the future would eventually collapse. I think that to really understand this moment in time, the best place to go is actually not the start of the Comintern, but really the collapse of the Second International, which I think can be dated to the outbreak of World War I in 1914.
Exactly. So at the start of World War I, you have the German SPD, the German Social Democrats, who notoriously pledged their support for Germany's imperial adventure. And there was a spirit of widespread patriotism across Europe, probably strongest in Germany than anywhere else.
Right, the spirit of 1914, they called it.
Exactly. Now, part of this was ideological. Longtime Social Democratic leader August Bebel. So August Bebel believed that Russia was this uniquely reactionary and anti-worker. He died just before the war, but he said he would register himself to fight for if Germany would go to war with Russia, with the feudalistic Russian Empire.
Yeah, so this is like the head of the Social Democrats claiming that, if a war happened, he would be the first to sign up to fight Russia.
I'll be the first, trust me. And we should point out that he was 67 years old. So, sure thing. Now, part of this was practical. Support for the war could stave off any state crackdown on left-wing political organizing, which was a huge thing in Imperial Germany.
There was a very tense relationship between the state and the Social Democratic Party.
Absolutely. And this paid off. During World War I, the German government basically suspended this oppression of working-class movements in exchange for the promise of loyalty. They called this peace within the castle, while they dealt with enemies beyond the walls.
And so I guess this truce that the socialists, or the Social Democrats rather, made with the ruling class would be very controversial within the Social Democratic Party, and would pretty famously lead to two different German communists coming to prominence.
Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht.
So how about this, Brendan? I'm sure you know about these figures. Do you want to say a few words about Luxemburg and Liebknecht?
Yeah, so Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht are absolutely two of the most fascinating, figures of this period. Rosa Luxemburg was active in socialist politics in a number of different countries. She actually came from a Jewish family in Poland, and so she was a founding member of, specifically Congress Poland for our 19th century Europe heads. She was a founding member of social democracy in the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, which notoriously took a position that was opposed to Polish independence, which it regarded as a reactionary project, unlike Pilsudski's Socialist Party or Polish Socialist Party, which was, independentist. And eventually she moved to Germany and she became one of the intellectual leaders of the left wing of the Socialist Party of Germany, or Social Democratic Party of Germany. And she was one of the polemicists against, Bernstein's revisionism, as it was called in the 1890s. She was one of the first people after Marx to try to do a serious sort of theoretical fleshing out and update of the sort of analysis of the global economy in books like the Accumulation of Capital. And I think she was also, considered one of the party's great speakers and orators. Karl Liebknecht was the son of Wilhelm Liebknecht, who had been one of the founders of the party in the heroic, pioneer era of LaSalle and corresponding with Marx and Engels. And so he inherited a great legacy, like Justin Trudeau. But much more admirable what he did with it. And Liebknecht specifically becomes famous because he was one of the only members of the SPD delegation in the Reichstag to vote against war credits,
for which he was drafted.
Yeah, and then he was drafted in response. I've never found a great source on this. There's been some rumblings that he was basically tipped off to be drafted by the STB leadership themselves because they wanted to get him out of there.
I think that's entirely plausible.
It makes sense to me,
given the relationship that existed between the central leadership of the party and the left, which was already hostile for years before the war, but the war made it absolutely, vicious.
Yeah. Tell us, what did the Social Democrats look like in this period, and why were they hostile towards their own leftists?
So the Social Democratic Party of Germany,
very big tent.
Yeah, between the 1870s and the 1910s, did something that is pretty extraordinary in the history of the global left, which is that they essentially built a nation within a nation. They were not just a political party that ran in elections, or a typical party of the left and a party of labor that runs in elections and also has a presence in the unions. They had a subculture embracing newspapers across the country, local clubs, and a whole range of sort of civil society and recreation activity. They had there were socialist chess clubs and choirs and Sunday schools, and a huge portion of the German industrial working class lived their entire lives within a world that was shaped by the Social Democrats, in the same way that other sections of the population lived in a world that was centered around the Roman Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church, or like the Junker aristocracy does that with the military. So they create this massive, sort of subculture. Millions of people were either regular voters, union members, or members of the party, and partly because, well, there's a few reasons that it develops ideologically the way that it does. So between 1878 and 1890, the party was actually illegal. And so there was not really a lot of ground for any significant, rightward movement, during that time. Friedrich Engels is also still alive. Karl Marx is actually still alive for part of this period. And then Friedrich Engels is still alive until the mid-1890s. So you have the old revolutionaries who are able to give, advice. And some of, Marx and Engels' famous writing in the latter period of their careers is advice to or criticism of the German socialist leaders as they start to build up this organization,
including figures like Bernstein, who you mentioned, right?
Yeah, and the young Karl Kautsky.
Yeah, who both took a much more kind of reformist, from what I understand, a more reformist attitude than Karl Marx did.
Yeah, to some extent. Kautsky's sort of in the center, but I'll get into that in a second. So during the period of the anti-socialist laws under sort of the Bismarck regime, the Social Democrats very much are, the outcasts of society. They're still able to do a lot of work in building up these institutions during that time. And then after 1890, the party is basically, decriminalized. And it begins to grow in terms of its electorate, its legislative presence, and its mass presence on all these levels that we've been talking about. And during that period, which is a period of huge economic growth for Germany, there are increasing, rightward tendencies. In fact, a social scientist in Germany in this time, Robert Michels, that theorizes what he calls the iron law of oligarchy, which is that basically any organization that becomes bureaucratic will progressively become more and more bureaucratic on the basis of observing the SPD.
Right. Is it the same as the iron law of institutions?
Something like that, yeah. Maybe there's, different translations of it. And so in that period, you get the crystallization of different factions. And because the SPD is so big, and because it's not, a tight ideological party in the way that 20th century communist parties, which we'll talk about later, would end up being, there's room for different interpretations. And so you have, the right wing of the party, which is basically made up of the trade union leaders, who are increasingly, they treat socialism as, to quote what left-wing socialists often said in this period, something to declaim about on ceremonial occasions. And then in practice, they were concerned with securing, material benefits for a relatively privileged section of the German working class.
Maybe a parallel here would be the British Labour Party, which sort of claimed to be socialist on paper until the 90s.
Yeah, very, very similar to that. And then in the center, you have people like Babel and Kautsky, who are theoretically very, very orthodox Marxists, and they're still adamant that the class struggle exists, and that ultimately the workers in Germany and anywhere else will have to struggle for power. In practice, they're mainly concerned with building up the strength of the party, and the idea somewhat creeps into their conceptions that there's nowhere to go but up, and that they would be able to continue to build the strength of the party, the strength of the organized working class, gradually until they got so strong that there'd be nothing the capitalists would be able to do. That's not sort of explicitly avowed, and I'm mainly, partly this is what left-wing critics would bring up later on. And then on the left, you have people like Rosa Luxemburg, the young Karl Liebknecht, another young Polish immigrant named Karl Radek. You have some Dutch socialists who are also active in the German movement, like Anton Pannekoek. And those people are, they're revolutionary socialists, and they are, fighting against the increasing bureaucratization of the party. They want autonomy for their, party schools and educational institutions. Many of them are intellectuals. They want autonomy for the newspapers that they control, and they want to make sure that the party's electoral representatives, the party's union representatives, are behaving in a revolutionary way. And there's a shifting alliances between these different groups. Sometimes you'd have a left-center alliance, and sometimes you'd have something of a right-center alliance. The great French historian Pierre Brouet goes into a lot of this in his book, The German Revolution, which I think is sort of one of the great sources for this period. And when the war breaks out, that makes this all very, very tense, because of course the right wing of the party are the alliance with the state during the war is essentially unproblematic to them.
The peace within the castle, they called it.
Yeah. For the left, they are dead set against it. For the center, it creates quite a problem, because they're opposed to the war. People like Kautsky do not want to support the German war effort. They don't echo, the German state's justifications for the war in the way that the right wing of the party does. But unlike the left, they are much more anxious to preserve the unity of the party. And so they'll only go so far in their criticisms.
Right. So the MPs from the center wing of the SPD, they might oppose the war in principle, but they themselves would not vote against war credits. Only Liebknecht would vote against them. Yeah.
It was only a handful on the left who did that. And if you look at what the intellectuals are saying during the war, they want to preserve the unity of the party, even though they're against the war effort, which the majority has decided to support, which the left considers this, centrist position to be no better than the social chauvinists, right? And so those relationships between the different factions, which a few years later would literally be, written in blood in the streets, become increasingly bitter during the war.
Yeah, and I guess you could say the first shot was fired with Liebknecht being drafted, because that was when Luxemburg established the Spartacus Society, basically within the SPD, as a secret revolutionary organization of like-minded left faction members of the Social Democrats.
Yeah, and they conduct anti-war agitation, in the streets, in the factories during the war. A lot of members are imprisoned. But yeah, they managed to sort of sustain an underground organization to some extent through the whole war.
Right, yeah. We should mention, named after Spartacus, the famous Roman slave rebel, which would, of course, later go on to be a movie scripted by Dalton Trumbo, Communist Party member. Yeah. But speaking back to Liebknecht, eventually he would be allowed to return back from the front because he was middle-aged. He couldn't really fight. He couldn't fight, really. And I think that they only had him digging ditches, and he couldn't do that very well. So they let him go back. But pretty soon after he returned to Parliament, to the Reichstag, he would eventually be expelled and arrested again, this time expelled by the SPD. Just curious, Brendan, do you know why he was expelled from the SPD? What was the last straw?
I don't know what the specific rationale was in the end.
It's a pretty good story, actually. he gave a speech specifically in no uncertain terms denouncing the Armenian genocide.
Wow. Huh.
I did not know that.
That's something.
Because of the German participation in it?
Oh, no, I don't know, but I don't know if he mentioned direct German participation. I'm not familiar with that subject. But he basically said that even if the Turks are Germany's allies, we must denounce these activities by the Ottoman state. This is unconscionable. And so that was what got him kicked. Just, yeah, a very kind of cool link there, and which speaks to his internationalism. That, as far as I can tell, was not there at all with the right-wing members of the SPD. If all you care about is bread, and maybe not so much the peace part, then you might turn a blind eye to, these atrocities abroad. Eventually, though, as Germany itself strained under wartime pressures, you started seeing less and less wartime enthusiasm among more right-leaning SDP members. Pretty notoriously, right near the end of the war, as it seemed like the war was going to end, a pair of fanatic nationalists in the Navy convinced the last remnant of the Baltic fleet to make a suicide charge against the British. And the sailors said, no, screw this. And there was a mutiny that eventually took over the entire port city of Kiel. And this mutiny would basically sow the seeds of destruction for the entire German Empire, because it would stretch into this broader movement of left-wing dock workers and sailors with calls for, like we said, bread, this time as well as peace. And what's quite interesting is that this is happening just after, maybe a year and a half after, really, the Russian revolutions that brought the Bolsheviks to power. And as a direct response to that, you start seeing individual members of the Social Democratic Party that are part of these sailors' councils that have started convening across Germany's cities. They are calling their councils workers' Soviets. Brendan, can you tell us exactly what the word Soviet means? What is a Soviet, and why is everyone making a Soviet in 1919?
Yeah, so the Soviet is a word that in Russian just means council, and it acquires its modern political significance in the 1905 revolution. So, leading up to 1905, you have sort of a cycle of escalating industrial struggle in Russia in the first few years of the 20th century. And with the, approaching defeat in the war with Japan and merging with sort of the political grievances of a wide range of sections of Russian society, the workers engage in a mass strike wave, probably one of the largest strike waves in history anywhere, that is simultaneously economic and political in the year 1905. And much to the surprise and the initial incomprehension and even sometimes the hostility of the various factions of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and other left-wing groups that were trying to organize the Russian working class, during the year 1905, Russia's industrial working class display an extraordinary tactical and strategic and organizational ingenuity. And they turn their strike committees in one factory into a strike committee in a whole city, and then they rework those strike committees into the Soviet, which is an elective body for which the constituencies are the workplace.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that it was the 1905 revolution that really inspired the German workers more than the Bolshevik Revolution?
No, not specifically.
Okay.
Yeah, so 1905, and the Soviets become sort of coordinating organs for the various political and industrial struggles of the Russian working class in the year 1905. Famously, a 26-year-old Lev Trotsky led the Petrograd Soviet. And when the 1905 revolution was defeated, most militants who'd been involved in the Soviets were imprisoned. Many people were executed. They were sent to Siberia. The revolutionary movement in Russia goes into a very, very deep recession. There's no talk of Soviets after that. Certainly, there isn't. Union activity isn't even illegal in Russia. But the collective experience of a generation of Russian working class militants who've been through that experience in 1905 stays with them. And so, in 1917, when a similar situation starts to develop, it becomes the February Revolution. Once as the Tsarist state disintegrates around them, the Russian workers form Soviets again. And then, of course, later in the year, the Bolshevik Party takes power and then walks in and hands it to, the Congress of Soviets at the end of October.
Right. Although, of course, you could say tragically that would not last.
Yeah. Actual Soviet power, like genuine, council democracy of the working people in Russia does exist for a period of months, but, not much longer than that. But while it exists, it becomes an inspiration to working class militants around, all over the world. So it's the combined experience of, Russia's three revolutions, basically, that, German workers are looking towards. There's one more bit of context for why the German workers start forming councils, which is that during the war, after the first couple of years, as the economic costs of the war effort really start to bite for the German working class, industrial struggle in Germany becomes quite intense, and you have basically collectives of shop stewards in the major factories, especially in places like Berlin, but also in Hamburg, Leipzig, Halle, and other places, who start to organize the factory struggle in defiance of the large, in defiance of the top union leadership who are carrying out an industrial truce during the war, and many of them supported the center left. And I mean center left within the terms of the SPD that we defined, the center left split, the independent social democrats that appear in 1917 as an expression of that, that shift against the war among the mainstream social democrats that you described. So the German workers had started to form, the same kind of factory level body that the Russian workers had turned into the Soviets in 1905 in the course of, their struggles, earlier in the war. And then those experiences sort of come together as the German working class takes that, that revolutionary step.
The way that these working class organizations rejected both the union leadership and the SPD leadership, it kind of reminds you of those lines you see a lot in Lenin at this time that talks about when the masses overtake the party. This seems to be a perfect example of that. I think that probably the most important short-term ramification of these various worker Soviets, I think that existed basically in every single German state and every city, was that they pressured all of the 22 German monarchs to step down, including, most importantly, the Kaiser. So within, I think, just a matter of 2 weeks, you saw the complete downfall of the German Empire, leading to the basically the creation of an ad hoc new government by the liberal aristocrat Max von Baden. And with all of the monarchists destroyed, with so much of the remains of the government formed in the dwindling war effort, the only new government left standing was basically that state within a state you mentioned of the SDP. And so Friedrich Ebert was proclaimed the new chancellor of Germany. And for the first time ever, the Social Democrats were now in the driver's seat of German politics.
Exactly. And on paper, this looks like the situation that Marx and Engels had been describing for decades. You have a workers' party in control of a major economy, at least theoretically. And in Russia, Lenin had really been putting a lot of his hopes on a German workers' revolution for years. And he believed, like Rosa Luxemburg, that cooperation between the Russian Soviet Republic and revolutionary Germany was needed to build this worldwide proletarian community.
Well, do you have anything to say, Brendan? We kind of ran through a lot just now.
The thing that comes to mind is sort of the situation of dual power. Again, to sort of compare the Russian and the German revolutionary processes. From the period of the February Revolution in Russia, you have what becomes known as the dual power, where you have the provisional government, which is trying to, contain the gathering chaos of Russian capitalism and the Russian war effort. And then you have the Petrograd Soviet, which is initially dominated by moderate socialist parties who support the provisional government, support the war effort, but nonetheless exists as a distinct, coordinating body of working class political power. And Lenin sees this situation and he recognizes that, the dual power cannot last and one of these institutions is going to crush the other. And so he has to win the argument first within the Bolshevik Party, and then the Bolshevik Party have to go out and win the argument within the politically active section of the Russian working class that it should be the Soviet that holds power. And that is another way of sort of condensing, the process of Russia's, two revolutions. And so in Germany in the fall of 1918, you also have something of a period of dual power. In some places, the councils are the only power. And in others, there's sort of a confused, remnant of the bourgeois government. The civil service hasn't disappeared or anything. But the coercive power of the state is basically collapsing as soldiers just decide to go home. Or the soldiers are involved in these political struggles. The difference, the central difference in Germany is that unfortunately, unfortunately from like a revolutionary socialist perspective, I know this isn't like, a political discussion we're having here, but the contrast with Russia is that the Social Democrats do not want to turn the organization of working class power that's come into being into the new state power. When Ebert takes power, he tells someone, it might be Max von Baden, but I'm not sure. He tells someone that he's taking power to prevent a social revolution. He says, the social revolution, I hate it like sin, right? Like the right-wing Social Democrats at this point are horrified by the prospect of socialist revolution in Germany. And so over the next few months, they do everything they can to end the dual power, but in the opposite way from how the dual power ended in Russia. They do everything they can to, convene a constituent assembly, have elections, create a new stabilized bourgeois state. And because, even though the hegemony of the SPD had been shaken during the war, it had not been broken. So the great mass of German workers still followed the SPD. And, many of them believed that, the SPD would still lead them to socialism through a new democratic Republican state.
Especially when a truly liberal state had never really existed in Germany.
Yeah, it never existed. You have a, quite authoritarian, a society where there was class-based suffrage and, a recognized aristocracy and all of these sort of like archaisms of imperial Germany, despite its incredibly modern...
Those 22 monarchs supported by the Junkers.
And so many German workers believed that, with these undemocratic obstacles removed, that the project of the democratic and social republic and all of that would be able to, to be implemented. And so when the Social Democrats basically, late in the year, essentially ask the councils to abandon any ambition of becoming the new political power, they actually do. They vote themselves out of existence. The same thing happens, or they vote themselves first into a subordinate economic role and then eventually out of existence. And remarkably, the same thing happens in Austria, where, everything that we've said about German social democracy, broadly it happens in the German-speaking part of Austria as well. The whole Austrian Empire is a different story, and you have a million different national social democratic parties.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We're planning to bring Jim from BC on very soon to talk again about what was going on in the former Eastern Austrian territories at this time.
Yeah. But in German, in what is known in this period of history as German Austria.
Right, which is basically the modern country of Austria.
Yeah. The trajectory of the workers' movement is quite closely tied. In fact, there's lots of people that go back and forth between the same party, the parties. And, similar to right-wing politics in German Austria as well.
Yeah, obviously, I guess there's one very famous Austrian in right-wing politics who would become prominent in Germany, yeah.
Kautsky was Austrian, for example. But yeah, so that also happens in Austria.
I'm guessing that was the Austrian Socialist Party in a similar condition in terms of like having these people at the top who were accustomed to the bourgeois lifestyle, had made a truce of some kind with capital.
Yeah. To a large extent, that is the case. There's like similar, right, center, and left groups in the Austrian party. One remarkable thing is that in Austria during the war, a young social democratic member of parliament named Friedrich Adler assassinates a government minister.
Oh my God.
I didn't know that, really?
Yeah. It's a remarkable example of a social democratic parliamentarian engaging in individual terrorism. Probably I think the only time that's ever happened.
Oh, actually, that's a great point to mention that we should get into really, really briefly. We should let the audience know that if anyone isn't aware, the phrase social democrat at this time was still very, very broad and basically included everything from trade unionism on one hand to full-on Marxist communism.
Yeah, I mean, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party
became the Bolsheviks. Yes, it wasn't until this specific moment that we start seeing the term social democrat be limited to the more right-wing members of labor power.
Yeah, the people who did not want a full-on social revolution, a full-on overturning of everything. Reformists.
Right. The people like Bebel, who, as we've talked about, would convince these worker Soviets to disband themselves and eventually would reconstitute and reconstruct a capitalist economy and bourgeois society in Germany. Sorry if I cut you off. Anything else you want to add, please do.
No, yeah, that was my spiel about the German dual power.
That was great. Yeah, I never knew that about it. It was Friedrich Adler, you said?
Yeah.
That's insane.
That's great. There's a lot of very fun assassinations in this period. I gotta say,
That's true.
Oh, this is the golden age of assassinations.
Oh man, there's so many. Yeah, we should.
And there were so many people who were like acquitted for like assassination. That's the most fascinating thing.
The Armenian genocide, revenge assassinations. Oh my god.
Sholem Schwarzbard and the Nemesis people.
Yeah, I was gonna say Schwarzbard is so great. I want to talk about that with Jim when you get him on. I don't think we're gonna get to Ukraine in this episode, but there's so much. Yeah. I was gonna say. One lasting consequence of this dual power era was that there were a lot of important concessions in both Austria and Germany that were made to all factions of the Social Democrats, which included basically releasing every political prisoner who was arrested by the government, including Karl Liebknecht. So very shortly after, with the formation of this new government by Ebert and Baden, you see Liebknecht be released, and pretty much immediately, Liebknecht and Luxembourg resume their revolutionary activities, connecting with other parties, or at least other groups formed by these former Soviet Council members. And on New Year's Eve 1918, they create the German Communist Party. A quick little note here is that the word communist was really not used very often in this era. It had sort of fallen out of fashion since Karl Marx's time. And it was really brought back the year before when Lenin formally changed the name of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democrats to the Russian Communist Party. Now you're seeing the pro-Bolshevik faction of the German Social Democrats become the German Communist Party. Across Germany in the first week of 1919, you see small groups of armed communists attempt to take power. We should mention that Luxembourg actually didn't support this. She was convinced that all of these uprisings were premature, and that even though there was not really a remaining German army to fend them off, she believed that these uprisings were too small and too scattered to achieve anything. But against her warnings, these small uprisings snowballed into what is now considered the German Revolution, or rather the Spartacist uprising within the German Revolution. You started to see a genuine mass militant workers' movement in the city of Berlin, with some outgrowths in other cities taking to the streets, forming barricades, and eventually basically dominating the city, if only for a few days.
Yeah, and then days later, you have the reprisals, which would come in the form of the Freikorps.
I guess I'm sure you know a fair amount about the Freikorps, Brendan, if you want to share any words here.
Yeah, so we've sort of been discussing, all of these different institutions in German society are collapsing and people are trying to put them back together again. Not all of those veterans are, anti-war. Not all of them are joining, any faction of the Social Democrats, let alone the communists. Many of those veterans are deeply, deeply embittered at their defeat. And they, under the influence of a motley collection of nationalist ideologues, including the former, the high command, right? Ludendorff and...
creator of the stabbed in back myth, yeah.
Yeah, they become convinced that the democratic revolution, the socialist threat, and initially in a backhanded way, and then increasingly more explicitly, Germany's Jewish minority, have destroyed the country and allowed it to be defeated. And they begin forming paramilitary organizations. In some cases, special forces and elite units, during the war directly transition into this. Sometimes they're sort of formed, in this context in late 1918. And they basically decide to fight their own war against Germany's enemies.
And are encouraged to do so by these right-wing ideologues. And
I guess the really big moment here is the fact that even though these right-wing forces are natural enemies of the Social Democrats, in practice, they become erstwhile allies against the Spartacist communists.
The Freikorps were not party militias in the way that, the SA was a dedicated party militia for the Nazi Party, but they were instrumental in the rise of the Nazi Party and the rise of the fascist movement more broadly.
Yeah, well, I guess the big thing is, like you said, they were from these veterans of World War I who didn't want to stop fighting for whatever reason.
Exactly. The war never ended for them, it just became internal. The enemies became internal enemies, and they were used by this new government. The term itself isn't really unique to this era. It had begun before that, but when we say Freikorps, we're talking about this era.
The early 20th century factions. Yeah, and I think this connects a lot with Mussolini's own writings about the fascist world he was imagining.
Yes, he had this vision of a trenchocracy that he talked about sometimes. Trenchocracy is the aristocracy of the trenches. It is the aristocracy of tomorrow. It is the aristocracy in action. It comes from the depths. Its quarterings of nobility are splendid blood red. On its coat of arms, one may depict a Frisian horse, a trench pit, and a hand grenade.
A lot of, horrifying implications there.
Yeah, chilling stuff.
The disbanded veterans today are the vanguards of the great army that will return tomorrow. the brutal and bloody apprenticeship of the trenches will mean something. There was a determination for this, especially in Germany, which, unlike Italy, was on the losing side, for this fighting and dying, spending years in trenches filled with human shit and vomit and everything else, and the stench of corpses. There was a determination that this would mean something. And what it would mean to them was pretty horrifying.
Yeah, I just, if I can just, like, bring in, I think, like, there's a pop culture, like, representation that I think conveys this really, really well. There's this one scene in Babylon, Berlin, where you see, like, a group of veterans, and they've gathered on the anniversary of this one battle that their unit, participated in. And, they sing these anthems from the war, and they recite this long list of, their comrades who died. And one of their sons, like, recounts the details of the battle. He's been, like, taught to memorize it. And I think it's an extraordinary, piece of television, because it makes it genuinely, like, it's actually quite affecting. And it I think conveys really strongly that idea of, like, yes, like, many German reactionaries in this period were motivated by the desire for, what we can look back and say is just, like, nightmarish participation in one of history's worst disasters, to have had this profound meaning and to have imbued them and the people who didn't survive with this, this nobility and this, essential role in the destiny of the German nation.
Exactly. Like, if you tell these people you are saving the German nation, a lot of them are going to believe it.
Yeah, and the son is like 10 years old, right? If I'm remembering this right.
Yeah, he looks like 10 or 12.
Yeah, like a proto, Hitler Jugend kind of type. And I think that also connects to this thing I wanted to get into for this episode, which is that Romanticism was an incredibly important, and I would say essential aspect of nationalism in this time. We've had episodes about the formation of national identities and how they use and abuse the past, but I think it's really important the way that romantic ideals of perfection and purity speak a lot to people, even if these ideals are false, are imaginary, and can be incredibly destructive.
Or can even look a bit ridiculous to us today. These things were very real and very important to these people at this time.
So you mentioned, Brendan, that there were some places in the German-speaking world where these Soviets never really gave up power. I think the most important example is Bavaria, which actually had a socialist government that would hang on for a bit longer than the socialists in Berlin.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting story, actually. Basically, as the German... So Bavaria was one of the largest independent monarchies in Germany. And Bavaria... Independent is not the word that I mean, but the monarchies that existed in the German Empire.
Independent of the Kaiser monarchy, as in, like, it's its own royal family.
Yeah.
And Bavaria is a very distinctive place. There's still a joke today that Bavaria is near Germany,
which is really funny and also a little ironic, considering when most Americans, at least, imagine Germany.
Yeah, we think of Bavarian stereotypes: the pretzels and the beer, Lederhosen. Yeah, that's all Bavarian. Isn't that just because that's where the American soldiers went, though?
Probably has a lot to do with it.
And immigration patterns, of course.
And it's just, like, more picturesque than, like, Franconia.
And it has such a distinct dialect.
Well, one important distinction with other parts of Germany that it shares with Austria is the fact that it's a very, very Catholic place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So as the Bavarian monarchy collapses, along with all the other ones in the fall of 1918...
Yeah, again, 22 monarchies collapsing simultaneously.
You have a government that's first formed by the independent Social Democrats. And then a young, discontented aristocrat, sort of the same mind, as these Freikorps that we've been discussing, assassinates the independent Social Democratic president or prime minister.
Yeah, the victim in this case was Kurt Eisner, who was a theater critic turned Social Democratic leader. He happened to be Jewish, and due to incredibly widespread anti-Semitism at this time, a guy named Anton Arkovalli shot him.
At which point, you have a ragtag band of anarchist artisan intellectuals who managed to take power in Munich, and they start trying to run the country. They ask Lenin for military assistance, and I think they promise something in return. They try to abolish money. They make some very serious efforts to create, like, a rich public educational system and, bring art to the people. It's also important to note that I think the revolutionary government in Bavaria never really held power outside of Munich.
And that's incredibly important because the government led by Hoffmann, who was the defeated Social Democrat, was able to reconstitute itself in Bamberg as the counter-revolutionary capital in Bavaria. And the countryside, I don't think any of the peasants, or farmers at least, really knew what was going on at all. Oh, here's just one little thing I want to jump in actually for that I think is kind of important. So, Eisner was killed by an anti-Semitic attacker. Just curious, the attacker, Anton Arkovali, had a very kind of complicated anti-Semitic motivation for killing him. Do any of you guys know what it was?
Yeah, basically he believed that there was a Jewish plot to sell out.
Well, no. Yeah, but it's much more personal than that. The anti-Semite who killed Kurt Eisner was himself Jewish, and that he was not allowed into a certain far-right organization in Munich, and hoped that by killing the most prominent Jewish person, probably in all of Germany, he could win their support as the truest self-hating Jew,
and not immediately be thrown in prison.
Yeah, and the group that he was trying to join was the Thule Society, which some people might be familiar with. Yeah. So this is really clear early fascist formations going on here. I would argue in direct response to the emergence of these socialist movements. You have these romantic nationalists, the children singing the songs of the battles, creating, like you talked about, the parallel society of the Social Democrats before the war. Now you're seeing after the war a parallel society of far-right, oftentimes incredibly racist right-wing forces trying to create an ethnically pure and completely militarized Germany.
Yeah, and the denouement of the revolution in Bavaria actually contributes a lot to that. Because basically after this group of anarchists, prove themselves to be not competent to run a revolutionary government, even in one city.
One quick little story here that I love is that Hoffman himself, the former president, he took the bathroom key with him when he left to Bamberg. And apparently that came up in the telegrams to Lenin asking for help. One of their lists of grievances was that no one could use the bathroom in the capital.
Right. And so at that point, a group of communists, led by a revolutionary of Russian Jewish origin named Eugen Levine, take power. And they try to put things into a more serious order. And when they're attacked by the government, they engage in reprisals and they start executing, bourgeois prisoners. They also do something that a lot of revolutionary governments in this period did that I absolutely love, which is that they repossessed luxury apartments and, gave them as housing, to the poor. But eventually they were crushed by, the same sort of social democrat Freikorps alliance that defeated the revolution in Berlin. Levine, before he was executed, when he was given his death sentence, is supposed to have said that all communists are dead men on leave. So that tells you a little something about, the stuff that he was made of.
Yeah, and if the whole quote here is great. It's we said, we communists are all dead men on leave. I do not know if you will extend my leave or whether I shall join Luxembourg and Liebknecht. In any case, I await your verdict with composure because I know, whatever your verdict, that the events of history cannot be stopped.
Unwavering faith.
So the upshot of this ends up being quite important for the history of Weimar Germany, because after this very, very brief left-wing experiment, Bavaria now becomes by far the most reactionary part of the Weimar state. There is consistently a right-wing government from the suppression of the revolution in 1919 to the end of Weimar. There's a lot of monarchist activity that goes on, and basically, the treatment of right-wing political violence in Weimar Germany was most of the time quite a light touch. But whenever a right-wing organization was banned in, Prussia, the largest state, or, at the federal level or in other places, their members would go to Bavaria. Bavaria becomes like the Miami of, internal German reaction. And that, makes it one of the seedbeds for Nazism. And you see things like the beer hall putsch just a few years after this.
Yeah, and of course, homegrown, there's a lot of homegrown Nazis in Bavaria too, because one of the commanders of the Freikorps that ousted and eventually killed Eugene Levine was Rudolf Hess. And this was some concern within Germany at this time that actually during this time, Albert Einstein, who I believe was living in Bavarian territory, petitioned the government for lighter treatment of captured socialists, but they obviously didn't listen. So with the failures of revolution in Germany, as we talked about both in Berlin and Bavaria, there's increasingly the sense that the Soviet Union is going to be isolated diplomatically. There are not going to be other socialist republics in the West that can be part of this joint revolutionary project. We talked about how Luxembourg and Lenin both believed that there had to be this kind of coordination, but now Luxembourg and Liebknecht have been murdered. The revolution has been nipped in the bud. The Western allies are elated about this, especially because this means that they know they can safely conduct their own conferences without fear of revolutionary agitation, but they're still very concerned about the threat that the Russian Revolution poses to global capitalism. One thing I want to mention is that when they were forming their Paris Peace Conference, initially they had wanted to form it in Geneva, but then a sudden outbreak of radical workers in Zurich convinced the Swiss government that they might not be long for this world. And so the Swiss said, no, America, please stay away. At the very least, because a huge delegation of allied aristocrats, industrialists, could maybe spark the whole revolution in Switzerland. So instead, they had the conference in Paris. Little recognition was paid to the Soviet government. There was a token delegation of whites, white emigres who were part of the displaced aristocracy. But generally, there was not much interest in any kind of cooperation with the new Soviet government. One little note I find kind of funny here, because there's a little symmetry here, is that when the Paris Peace Conference first converged, it wasn't supposed to be a conference to set out the future course of world politics. Instead, it was meant to plan that conference. But when so many delegates arrived in Paris, they realized, you know what, guys, we're all here. Let's just start getting down to business. So they started infamously redrawing borders, determining who would get what part of land, how these countries would benefit from the new order, how other countries would be punished. But it was clear to everybody that revolution was in the air. And like we said, this was a major concern. As far away as the American West Coast, very soon after the German Revolution, you have a massive labor strike in Seattle, heavily involving socialist activists. In the Netherlands, a socialist leader claimed the revolution was imminent. He was wrong, but in any case, every city in the Netherlands was placed under martial law for a few weeks during this period. Even in Argentina, there was a bloody riot. A strike led by communist workers turned into a bloody riot known as Semana Trágica, when a whole bunch of Argentine police machine gunned down these hundreds of workers, killing up to 700 of them. What's kind of interesting is that, we talked about the Allies were very set on containing the Soviet threat, but not all of them thought they were going to win. There's kind of a funny quote here from a Canadian delegate, if you want to read this, Sam.
Many, and not just those on the left, refused to panic. Over lunch at the Hotel Majestic one day, Canadian delegate Oliver Mowat-Bigger chatted cheerfully that, quote, the feeling of all of us was that money had too much say in the world. Selfish money, that is. The logical conclusion is communism, and we shall no doubt all arrive there in a quarter of a century or so.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. Yeah, it was a very, I think it shows that there was a lot of fear around, but generally this fear was much more hostile. Macmillan had an unusually optimistic view about the future, but everybody seemed to think that revolutions were spreading.
Just something that I'm reading recently coincidentally has a great quote about, from Lloyd George about the fear of the world revolution. So one of the most prominent figures of the conference, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, in 1919, as Britain is fighting insurgency in Ireland, and there's a very, very radical strike that goes on in Glasgow. This is known as the period of the Red Clyde. Lloyd George says, quote, the whole of Europe is filled with the spirit of revolution. There is a deep sense not only of discontent, but of anger and revolt amongst the working men against the pre-war conditions. The whole existing order in its political, social, and economic aspects is questioned by the masses of the population from one end of Europe to the other. And this is probably the most astute, leader of the old order in Europe at that time. So you can see how, deadly serious the fear was.
Yeah, no, and one part of this fear was the fact that the Western allies at this time, although they did a lot to undermine the revolutionary efforts in Russia, they realized they really were unable to overturn the revolution. The White Army that existed to fight the Soviets just simply wasn't cut out for the job. And whenever the British sent them uniforms and weapons, almost always what would happen would be that those weapons and uniforms would go into the hands of the Reds. There was a lot of discussion about sending troops, and some troops were sent, especially American troops and Japanese troops, to Russia. They weren't as involved in as much combat as activity as you might expect. A big part of the issue was that the French and the British basically refused to send their troops to die in Russia because they were worried that that would cause too much unrest at home. We see how things like Gallipoli, how these deaths of soldiers galvanized political sentiments in the home country. And so there was a fear, especially in France, that sending veterans who had just barely survived the Somme to freeze to death in Russia on behalf of a Russian government that none of them had any loyalty to, and a Russian government that everybody seemed to know was hopelessly corrupt, was not going to win anybody any favors. Instead, the French had this plan that they called the sanitary cordon, which was a term from the Black Plague, which they used to describe their policy of supporting anti-Bolshevik governments in Central Europe to oppose the USSR and, in their understanding, contain the spread of communism. One little sidebar here, though, is that some on the American delegation actually were a little bit more optimistic about the USSR. They shared that Canadian delegate Bigger's optimism. And there were these two guys, if you've heard of them, Brendan, named William Bullitt, who was a diplomat with some left-wing sympathies, and Lincoln Steffens, who was his friend, who was a radical socialist journalist that was invited to the conference. They actually made this genuine attempt to visit Lenin, meet him personally, and hope to bring the USSR into the international community.
Yeah, so Lincoln Steffens, he was a journalist and he was an opponent of the First World War. And that sort of becomes the main thing that determined how people responded to the Russian Revolution was the way that they had felt about the war. But yeah, so Steffens during this period famously, he travels to, revolutionary Russia, and he comes back and he famously says, "I have seen the future and it works."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He really believed that what was going on was a genuine revolution that was, effective and necessary. The Bolsheviks were the only faction within Russia that was capable of getting rid of the poverty and corruption that he believed had been previously endemic to Russian society under the Tsar and was still rampant among the whites. At the end of the week that they spent in Russia, where they actually met Lenin himself, Bullitt and Steffens had thought that they had actually made some kind of a deal that they would be able to bring back to the table at Versailles that would allow for some kind of permanent truce with the Bolshevik movement. Especially now that the revolutionary activity in Germany had ceased, there was a bit of a thaw happening very briefly in this moment in early 1919 between the Allies and the Soviets. As soon as Bullitt and Steffens got back to Paris, though, a few events would happen that would totally torpedo any hope of Soviet Western détente. The first of these was the revolution in Hungary. So just like in Germany, there was a social democratic government in Hungary that was hastily set up. This liberal aristocrat, sort of a Max von Baden character, named Mihaly Károlyi, had established a government, but it was very weak. And that pretty quickly, especially when it came out that his government was unable to resist attempts by the Allies to give large chunks of Hungary, including Transylvania, to the government of Romania, ended up being ousted, and a labor leader named Bela Kun came into power. Bela Kun was kind of a funny character because he was a Hungarian soldier. He was taken by the Russians as a prisoner and brought all the way to the Urals in a prison camp, but that meant that he was in Russia during the Russian Revolution, and he ended up learning Russian while in jail and becoming part of the Soviet government. After Hungary had their own revolution and the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was replaced with this new liberal government, Bela Kun was able to go back home and very quickly began agitating for better conditions for workers, eventually leading to a more radical government taking power. And what's kind of funny is that although Kun's faction was a very small part of the broader workers' movement, because of his perceived connections to Moscow, he was appointed foreign minister, because the Social Democrats believed that Bela Kun would be able to call in Soviet aid to defend them from the reactionaries and also from the Romanian army that was coming in soon.
Yeah, and the period of the Hungarian Soviet Republic is really, really fascinating. Because in addition to, sort of revolutionary, political organizers like Bela Kun, people like Tibor Samueli, you have a faction of the Hungarian radical intelligentsia that grasps at state power. So the philosopher and literary critic, George Lukács.
Yes, who would later go on to direct Star Wars.
Yes. Finds himself in a position of state power. And he said later that, they were not interested in creating a land of milk and honey. they were interested in ascetic and immediate communism. And so they really had this intensely utopian view. And I mean that sort of in all senses of the word utopian, of what they were going to be able to do with state power in Hungary. And so they did things like they promoted, publishing and literacy and cinema and theater. And they made extremely radical, creative, artistic work available to the masses. And this is the kind of thing that they were concerned with while they were fighting a war with Romania, indirectly a war with the Western powers. And there was, very intense struggle with the internal, counter-revolution, and you have the creation of this fantastically named revolutionary militia called the Lenin Boys. So even while the revolutionary regime is, fighting for its life against, enemies that would soon overwhelm it, you have these radical, artists and intellectuals and writers who've attached themselves to the revolutionary state power, who embark on this remarkable attempt to sort of bring, the state power to the support of like the furthest edge of modernist culture, and to bring the furthest edge of modernist culture to the people. That was also a feature of the Munich Soviet Republic as well. There's just something, this like the breakdown of the social order sort of allows like a fraction of the fin de siècle Bohemians to very briefly grasp at, power to do whatever they wanted with society.
The meanest thing you could say about either the Hungarian or the Bavarian socialist governments were it was sort of as if like the DSA ran a country.
Exactly. Almost exactly like that.
Yeah. And you mentioned art, that there was so much cross-pollination with working class movements and artistic modernism at this time, which is really interesting. At the LA County Museum of Art, of all places, I just saw this exhibit where they had two different artworks that were basically tributes to Karl Liebknecht, made by social democrats, not even part of the Spartacus movement, basically to honor his legacy. And these were popular avant-garde artists who saw themselves as part of an intellectual vanguard, but also wanted to be part of the broader public art community of working class people and share their art with the masses. There would be another much shorter-lived Soviet, even farther west in Europe, about as far west as you could get. Some of our listeners might even know what I'm talking about here. The pretty well-known, sadly not especially influential Limerick Soviet in Ireland. I'm sure you know all about this, Brendan.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating sort of period because as people probably know, the revolutionary wave in Europe corresponds to, or coincides with the War of Independence in Ireland. There's the formation of the First Dáil, the proclamation of independence, the guerrilla war, against the British. But what many people don't know, partly because even like the mainstream nationalists or Republican historiography in Ireland does not celebrate it, is that there's also a wave of industrial unrest in Ireland at this time, and there are strikes in all kinds of sectors. Like labor in Ireland is it's not in the position of strength that labor in Germany or Russia was, because the character of Irish industrialization was very different. There was only a concentration of heavy industry in the north, and in the in shipbuilding and so on around Belfast. And in the rest of the country, you have processing, you have things that are directly linked to food, you have mines in certain places, but you don't have, there's no, Ruhr or Youngstown or Turin in Ireland, and there still isn't. But you do have a remarkable flurry of strikes in these light industries. And because of the example of what's going on in the continent, basically, I think as you sort of mentioned, earlier in the episode, like workers all around the world sort of become trigger happy in terms of forming councils.
Yeah. Because the town of Limerick had some strategic importance, the British Army occupied it. They didn't really have a full occupation of the entire country. They would just go into certain places, because they were spread so thin, they would go into certain places where they knew the IRA would likely strike. So they set up shop in Limerick. But what they didn't realize about Limerick was that it had a very high union density, and that the unions of Limerick were incredibly radical, both in their orientation towards the question of Irish nationalism, and also in their attitude towards Marxism and revolution. So what happened underneath the noses of the Brits was that the workers of Limerick secretly made a pact to create a kind of workers' cooperative that they called the Limerick Soviet, and orchestrated a general strike to starve out the British, while supplying each other through mutual means. They had a newspaper. They distributed food across the various people. So and also what they did was that it was a boycott also. So they organized any punishments of any merchants who were still working with the British.
Yeah, so you can sort of compare that to like the original function of the Soviet in Russia in, say, the period of 1905 or the period of February, where it's a very powerful coordinating body for working class struggle on a number of different levels.
It would eventually be dissolved after a couple of weeks. And I think that its dissolution, which was bloodless, actually is a great illustration of a process that we talked about many months ago in our episode on the wind that shakes the barley. Because eventually what killed the Irish Soviet wasn't the British directly. It was the fact that the mayor of Limerick, who was, as far as I can tell, a British sympathizer, convinced the local priests to say that anybody participating in the Soviet was going against the wishes of God, and that they had to, keep going to the stores of the pro-British merchants and all that and end the collective. And it worked. The Soviet dissolved. Moving out of Ireland, one other important event galvanized Western opposition to communism and socialism in general in this period. What was that, Sam?
Yeah, the assassination of Clemenceau. Sorry, the assassination attempt of Clemenceau by an anarchist is the important part.
Yeah, he was an anarchist who was pro-Soviet, but he was still himself not really part of any organized communist movement.
Yeah, he declared himself a Bolshevik, whatever, but that doesn't really mean...
Yeah. He wasn't part of any movement, really. Supposedly, when Clemenceau was shot, the assassin fired 7 times and only hit once, and supposedly Clemenceau shouted off from the ground where he lay that no Frenchman should be that poor of a shot, and that instead of going to prison, the guy should be taken to a shooting range to get gun lessons. In any case, though, this assassination attempt, probably even more than the abortive revolutions in Hungary and Ireland, was the catalyst for a widespread crackdown on socialist organizing across the Allied powers.
Yeah, not just in France.
No, the world over. Just days after the assassination attempt on Clemenceau, supposedly there was a conspiracy of Spanish and Cuban workers in New York City that were trying to assassinate Wilson. I'm a little skeptical that this plot ever existed, but 14 Spanish speakers, anarchists, all of them, were arrested and deported. This led directly to this broader American crackdown, and the infamous Pomeroys led to a whole bunch of socialist organizations, mostly headed by immigrants, which being destroyed, and any foreign-born socialist they could find being deported. Emma Goldman famously was deported in this era. There was a ship known as the Buford was dubbed the Soviet Ark because almost 250 Russian nationals were dumped on it and sent back to Russia. And one particularly nasty consequence of these deportations was the fact that a strong number of these Russian emigres happened to be Jewish, and this was used to justify a sudden resurgent wave of anti-Semitism pretty much across the entire globe at this time, as the participations of a handful of individual Jewish people in these socialist movements was used to allege that all of the world's Jewish people were involved in some kind of malicious socialist conspiracy.
Yeah, which, it's important to point out that there were a lot of Jews in socialist and communist organizing, but there was a reason for that. It's not because of some sinister plot.
That socialism was an emancipatory movement, and so people who had been the losers of the previous world were more interested in being part of this one. It wasn't just Jewish people who were involved in politics like this. Like we talked about how in Ireland, anti-British forces in Ireland often oriented towards socialism. In other parts of the world, you had groups like Latvians, for instance, were heavily overrepresented in the USSR, Serbs in Yugoslavia. There's a long history of certain social ethnic groups being more likely to support certain types of politics, But in this case, the participation of Jewish people in socialism and communism was grossly exaggerated with a deliberate, malicious intent.
Yeah, it's important to, there's a really great book called A Spectre is Haunting Europe. It's called by a historian named Paul Hainbrink, and it's a history of the Judeo-Bolshevik myth. And he makes the point quite well early on that the Judeo-Bolshevik myth was not some kind of, empirical response to the actual participation of Jews in revolutionary movements. It's an ideological attempt to explain, the revolutionary subversion of the social order as a whole. And, that's true to the extent that, in this period and subsequently, revolutionary figures who were not Jewish were very frequently assumed to be so.
Oh, yes, yeah. Kotsky, for instance. Yeah, Karl Kotsky was the victim of anti-Semitic harassment, even though he was not Jewish at all. Kerensky in Russia was called a Jew by his opponents. The rise of Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracies are most strongly associated with the white Russian forces, as well as, of course, the far-right factions in Germany that were coalescing into the Nazi Party. But we should mention that English speakers' hands weren't clean in this period, and that Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracies were widely circulated in the US and Britain. The Daily Mail was actively involved in publishing defamatory claims about pretty much all Jewish people, claiming that Jewish communities across the world were behind whatever atrocities were allegedly happening in Soviet Russia.
This is also when Winston Churchill,
yes,
in this context...
That's who we were about to quote,
Yes, exactly, yeah. So Winston Churchill notoriously... read what Winston Churchill had to say about this imagined conspiracy.
Communism among the Jews is nothing new. From the days of Weishaupt of the Illuminati to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky, Bellakun, and Luxemburg, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the overthrow of society on the basis of envious malevolence and impossible equality has been steadily growing.
And I think the crucial thing, or a crucial thing to note about Winston Churchill's version of the Judeo-Bolshevik myth, is that he in fact divided the Jewish population of the world into two groups. The bad international Jews who supported the revolutionary, socialist project, and the good national Jews who were either or patriots of the countries they lived in or Zionists. And Churchill supported Zionism as a means of channeling that disruptive Jewish energy and putting it in one place where it wouldn't bother, Western civilization.
And he was hardly the only person with that point of view.
Yeah, that's why like whenever anybody tries to lionize Churchill, it's just despicable. Like he was such an anti-Semite. He was so horrible with India. One thing I want to kind of touch on this quote in particular, which I find kind of interesting, is that by mentioning the Illuminati, he's really kind of playing all the hits here, I feel like.
Yeah, but there were no Jewish members of the Bavarian Illuminati.
Yeah, but the thing is, like you said, the guy he mentions, Weishaupt, he was a Catholic. There weren't any Jewish members of the Illuminati. There's no evidence that he had any Jewish background. He's doing the thing like you mentioned where it's anti-Semitism almost takes on this spiritual valence, where somebody who is seen as an opponent of the national order is basically assumed to be Jewish regardless of the facts of the situation. It's part of the romanticism of nationalism. We should mention that even in Latin America, which had small populations of Jewish immigrants, you saw these widespread Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracies being circulated. So we mentioned the Semana Trágica in Argentina, where there were clashes between communist workers and police. As a response to those clashes, far-right mobs would ransack the Jewish neighborhood of Buenos Aires, beating random Jewish people in the street. And then across the river in Montevideo, the Uruguayan police claimed that they had exposed a plot by 40 Jews across the capital to take over the entirety of the Southern Cone and establish a Jewish communist state. Now, personally, I want to meet those. I want to meet those 40 guys who'd be able to take over the whole continent. They sound pretty tough. But in any case, not only did the U.S. basically take these claims at face value, and that the U.S. government at this time basically said, "Oh yeah, we believe that Jewish people in Brazil and Argentina are spreading revolution." These theories in Brazil specifically would actually last pretty long into the 20th century. I think, Sam, you know about the Plano Cohen that circulated?
Yes, the Cohen plan. It's this claim, kind of like the Protocols, claiming that there's this Jewish plan from Bellakun, actually.
The name referred to Bellakun, the Hungarian leader we mentioned earlier. So as far away as Brazil, you see these malicious conspiracies taking root. And although anti-Semitism probably was less widespread among Brits and Americans than Germans or White Russians, we really should hammer home that English speakers' hands weren't clean here. And especially because American and British anti-Semites probably played the biggest role in publishing, translating, and transmitting anti-Semitic text. You know, everybody knows about Henry Ford, but there were a lot of especially very wealthy Americans who were very interested in promoting anti-Semitic causes across Europe and often cultivated ties with anti-Semitic groups in Europe at this time. By the spring of 1919, the Western Allied powers had now pretty formally consolidated into a unified counter-revolutionary bloc. They were opposed to the existence of the Soviet Union, but they knew that it was unlikely that they could really overthrow the Bolshevik government, so they would concern themselves with containing its expansion. Around the same time, Wilson proposed his 14-point plan for a lasting democratic peace, and Clemenceau famously claimed, the Almighty God only had 10, and Wilson boards us with 14. The most important of these points was the creation of the League of Nations, this global tribunal to resolve disputes. One little kind of funny sidebar here is that the League of Nations was basically designed by Jan Smuts, the South African Prime Minister. It might not surprise you that he had no interest in allowing the League of Nations to discuss the rights of colonized peoples. Yeah, and he even actually sought to use the League of Nations to expand the borders of South Africa into former German colonial possessions.
Like Namibia, which actually they would keep until they didn't leave until the 90s.
And not only were colonized Africans completely excluded from the League of Nations, but Bolshevik Russia was not part of the League either. It was simply uninvited. I think that I would argue that as a direct response to this exclusion, there was a desire within the socialist world, especially within Russia, to construct a parallel international body that could have a similar role of the League of Nations. And they would create a council similar to the Paris Peace Conference in Moscow to do this. This, as we said, this was the other table that was created by those who weren't let in the door at Versailles. This table would be known as the Comintern. In March 1919, the Comintern would be founded. The first meeting opened with a tribute to Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Something kind of funny here is that when they formed this first council in March in Moscow, just like the Council of Versailles, they didn't want this to be the Comintern meeting. They wanted to plan the meeting. But again, when so many people showed up, they realized, okay, let's do it. And just like Versailles, they had members from all over the world, members of many of the new countries that had broken away from the Russian Empire. Poland, Lithuania, Finland were all present, many of them actively involved in attempted revolutions in their own countries. There were members from Japan. There were even members from Korea, which at this time, I believe, had just or quite recently been occupied by Japan. The Korean members actually were not communists. They had tried to go to the conference in Paris, but because it was a lot farther than Moscow, they said, oh, whatever, let's just go to Moscow instead. There were even members from China who would be instrumental in distributing communist literature, which would have a very important long-term impact. My main question for you here, Brendan, is that what was the purpose of the Comintern as it was established in 1919, and what exactly did it end up doing?
That's a really good question. So basically, the purpose of the Comintern was to be the organizing leadership of world revolution. That was, the intended purpose. And it was so tightly bound up, the formation of the Comintern was so tightly bound up in that belief and hope for the success of the world revolution that Lenin and other Bolsheviks very frequently said, when it was formed, that they expected the next conference not to be in Moscow, but instead to be in Berlin or Paris.
Right, which had become revolutionary. Yeah.
Despite the setbacks that were starting to come in, there was still the hope. And they were committed from the very beginning that the Communist International would not be like the Second International. And that manifests concretely in two main ways. One of that has to do with the organization and the discipline of the Communist International, and the other has to do with its scope. So basically, the opinion of the, incipient communist movement was that the Second International had failed because it wasn't disciplined enough to ensure, for two reasons. One was that it wasn't disciplined enough to ensure that the national parties actually followed international discipline rather than, capitulating to national chauvinism like they did in 1914. And the other reason, and this is especially an argument that Lenin makes, is that it was too based on the most privileged section of the world working class, that is, the better off sections of workers in the imperialist, countries.
Right, the labor aristocracy.
Yeah, and so they were determined to build an international organization that would be tightly organized. Lenin, and the Bolsheviks at this point have also, they're advocating a new conception of how communist parties should operate, that they should be very, very different from the old, big tent social democratic parties, and we sort of flesh that out with the example of the SPD. They wanted to have groups that were tight and disciplined, that operated with really, really rigorous unity of action.
Yeah, we could say Eugene Levine from Bavaria, not Ernst Toller, who he replaced.
Yeah, exactly. that would be able to make quick turns tactically, and that would be able to, in short order, carry out, the insurrectionary seizure of power. And that also meant that the International itself would be disciplined, that decisions of the International would be, materially binding on the national parties.
What does that mean? Could you explain that?
What that means is that if you did not follow the discipline of the Communist International, then the leadership could be disciplined, or in fact, the party could actually be expelled from the Comintern. The Second International had never done this.
So it's a continuation of what the policies on of democratic centralism and all that stuff.
And so that might seem a little bit harsh on paper, but that also seems to suggest that if there's that disciplinary mechanism, that means that the Comintern is a much stronger international body than the League of Nations, which was basically unable to do anything.
Yeah. And then the other thing was that, they wanted it to be genuinely international in the sense of extending beyond, the centers of capitalism, Europe, North America, Japan, to embrace the entire world. And it is remarkable how much they succeeded in realizing that. And it's also, I think it's one of the most fascinating things that I've found in reading, communist material from this time is how often they make this argument. And how much they emphasize it. So one example, so we've talked about the formation of the Communist Party of Germany, but in 1920, the Independent Social Democratic Party splits, and they decide to join the Third International, or a section of it decides to join the Third International. And part of how that process plays out is that they have a conference to decide which international to join. And the Bolshevik leader, Grigory Zinoviev, comes to the conference, and he speaks on behalf of the Third International. And the Menshevik leader, Yuli Martov, comes to the conference, and he tells them not to join the Third International.
It's really,
So you have these two Russian revolutionaries confronting each other in the German city of Halle before an audience of thousands of German working-class militants. And Zinoviev gets up and he says, we are not creating an international for workers with white skins. We are creating a genuine international. He talks about the conference that the Soviet state and the Communist International had organized at Baku of, anti-colonial nationalists from across Asia. And he says, at Baku, I felt for the first time the breeze of the world revolution. I stress not the European revolution, but the world revolution. And I mean, it's incredibly touching to me that an audience of German metalworkers were moved by, the idea of a world revolution sweeping Asia and joined the people who were advocating that's sort of, that internationalism was it was very real, to working class militants at that time.
It's beautiful, especially thinking about that today, where that's just kind of unthinkable.
Yeah, it's difficult. And so the early Comintern, very soon, there are parties. Sometimes they're formed by small groups in these countries. Sometimes they're formed by groups of exiles in Moscow. But you have parties, you have a Chinese party, a Korean party, a Japanese party, an Indonesian party that's partly formed by left-wing socialists from the Netherlands working with Indonesian nationalists. You have a party in South Africa that is initially mostly white and then becomes, majority African later on.
Yeah. I think that was one where there was a lot of internal struggles where it took a long time for the actually genuinely committed socialists who were opposed to white supremacy, taken over.
Yeah. You have a party that's formed in Palestine. And that also becomes a very complicated situation with the relationship between Jewish and Arab, communists.
As, nationalism collides, with socialism,
You have parties formed in South America. And as you mentioned earlier, this is a period of, a political awakening among, African Americans. And you ultimately have a very significant cadre of, African American and Afro-Caribbean, militants and intellectuals who are attracted to communism, not so much because of what the parties in their countries are doing, but because of the anti-colonial internationalist message emanating from Moscow.
Yeah, Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Cyril R. James from Jamaica, one of the best. Great writer.
Harry Haywood, one of these early black communists, said that he did not so much join the American Communist Party as the Communist International. Yeah, so that's sort of the basic idea. And one thing that I would stress is that although it became much more bureaucratic later on, the early Communist International, the first few congresses, the second Congress is held in 1920, the third is held in 1921, the fourth is held in 1922. After that, they become less frequent. Those first few congresses are extraordinary for the vigor and the openness of the debate that took place there. And you really do have, radical intellectuals and working class militants from all around the world gathering in Moscow to try to work out a strategy for world revolution. And everyone is able to speak their piece. Obviously, there's an enormous respect for the Russian leaders, but their arguments did not win out automatically in any way at that point in the early 20s. Many people criticize them. For two examples, Lenin has a long argument with three different groups of communists, actually, one in the Netherlands, the Netherlands and Germany, one in Britain and one in Italy, over whether the new Communist Party should run in elections and whether they should take part in the existing unions or they should form their own.
With the Germans and Italian left communists saying no, they must reject any kind of parliamentarism.
Yeah. And Lenin also has a long argument with an Indian communist named M.N. Roy over how communists are going to relate to the anti-colonial movement and how they're going to relate to the different class forces that exist in the colonized countries. And that's something that is a subject of controversy, for a very, very long time. And
even still, there are writers in India today arguing about to what extent India has a class structure that can be analyzed with a Marxist lens.
And so you have, at that early stage in the existence of the Comintern, you have a report on the colonial question that's delivered, based on Lenin's notes, and then you have a counter report delivered by Roy.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's no sense, again, even though psychologically, there's an intense respect for the Russian revolutionary leaders because they had done it, for the first time in human history. But in an organizational and a political sense, there is not any kind of automatic deference, and there's no sense in which they get their way. And I guess the last thing that I want to point out about the early Comintern is that a distinct communist political culture does not come into being full formed, right? You have lots of different groups that come together to form the new communist parties. There's a general picture that, the communists were split from the left wings of the old socialist parties. And that's maybe 65% of the truth. Because there were also anarchists and syndicalists who were attracted to the Russian Revolution, right? They saw the Russian workers form councils and then take over. There were, a large section of the industrial workers of the world in the United States move into the Communist Party. At one point, the syndicalist CNT in Spain votes to join the Comintern. Groups as diverse, the Norwegian Labour Party joins the Comintern for a few years, actually, until the mid-20s. The Bund spends a long period debating whether to join the Comintern.
It's the Jewish Bund of
sort of like a Jewish social democratic party in Eastern Europe. And you also have anti-colonial nationalists. So there are left-wing socialists, but there are also anarchists and syndicalists of various kind. And Lenin, Lenin was very, very adamant that it was much worse to be a right-wing socialist than it was to be an anarchist or a left-wing communist. His polemic with the left-wing communists was very harsh, but the goal was always to keep them on side because, whatever flaws they might have, they were genuinely committed to revolution. What he was most afraid of was that you would have, centrist socialists who only talked revolution, and when they came down to it, they wouldn't take the leap. But he knew that the leftists and the anarchists even would, be willing to do it.
At the start of this episode, we talked about the ways that people misinterpret these sectarian divisions that happened during this time because they don't really understand the context they existed in. I think a similar problem you see today, especially on the left or whatever, is that people bring their sectarian baggage from modern political discussions into the past. And they assume that whatever a left communist might mean on Twitter today means exactly what Lenin meant when he called left communism an infantile disorder. They assume that anarchism today has something to do with what anarchists were doing in the 1910s and 20s.
Infantile disorder, in the context that Lenin meant it, was a growing pain for the movement that would be relatively easy to overcome. Whereas reformism was a deadly disease.
Yeah. Whereas these days on Twitter, you can make a comment about how China has a market economy and you'll get people calling you infantile in your replies.
As if it has something to do with Later on, there would be official doctrinary theorists in the Soviet Union who did use it to mean left-wing critics are like children. So it starts relatively early. But it's certainly not what Lenin meant.
Later on, a lot of things would change in the USSR. Yeah, to say the least. That's a great time to start moving on here and getting to the least fun part of this episode, which is going to be the fact that although the Comintern was great at connecting socialists from across the world, as far as I can tell, it was incredibly ineffective at helping those local socialists actually achieve their material aims on the ground. Because after this revolutionary wave in Western Europe in 1919, 1920, the setbacks would only pile up, and the Comintern would be unable to foster, or I would even argue perhaps unwilling to foster, further revolutionary activity in the West, probably out of fears of incurring some kind of reprisal on the USSR itself.
No, Soviet foreign policy and Comintern policy was very timid about this stuff after a certain point.
Yeah, which I think was, I would honestly argue that one of the only genuine through lines you see of really Soviet foreign policy and the Comintern from like 1920 up until 1991 is the fact that the USSR was generally very afraid of scaring the West too much when it came to fomenting revolution abroad.
No, there was always this fear of being, this feeling they were encircled and this feeling of that they were going to be destroyed.
Yeah, and even from very early on, basically from the time of like the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, there was this tension that existed between like the interests of the Soviet state and the Russian Communist Party as the leading party of the world revolutionary movement. And this was a tension that the early Bolsheviks were quite honest about and they were aware of. And there were extensive, sometimes in the early Comintern, there were people who criticized, like things like the 1922 Treaty of Rapallo with Germany. And they argued that, it meant that the German communists would be hamstrung and they wouldn't be able to work for revolution. And, I think you can generally say that in the early years, that tension was, it was negotiated in a very complex way. And there's this, I really like the sort of the frame that you've set up comparing, Moscow and Versailles here, because through the 1920s and 30s, there is a perception on both sides of the barricades that the Comintern is a kind of world shadow government. And the Comintern sends, operatives and emissaries around the world to deal with particular practical tasks for the different communist parties, or even just to convey, political advice and instruction. And those people become figures of deep superstitious fear for, all the police of the world, right? There's this sense that they are this secret force with this great, great power to foment strikes and riots and to assassinate kings and presidents and all of these things. And to some extent, workers and militants, they embrace that idea as well. There's an incredible passage in a paper about sort of the communist movement in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, which is one of a handful of situations in Canadian history where communism acquired a mass audience among workers was in Cape Breton, which is a coal field, in the 1920s and 30s. And there's a historian named John Manley who's written a fantastic paper about this. And he talks about, this, I don't know if it was maybe a film screening or something like this, where, the family members of these, left-wing, coal miners in Cape Breton were being shown, scenes of combat from the Russian Civil War. And what he argues is that this was sort of used to create the sense that, that they had a protector somewhere, right? That these workers were always getting the shit beaten out of them by the police. And in fact, the Canadian Army was mobilized, to combat strikes in this region during this time, that, they might lose, the fights here. But in Russia, there was a workers' army. And there was a sense that that was, the ultimate protector for, the oppressed workers around the world. And so there's this parallelism, right, where both sides of the barricades believe that, Moscow maybe at least has this power, right?
Yeah, and in Robin Kelly's Hammer and Hoe, he mentions that a lot of African-American communists in the 30s really believed that Stalin was looking out for them. And that as bad as the, white supremacist terror campaign in the South might be, they had the Soviet Union on their side. I guess the tragedy here is that it does seem like for workers on the ground, this support was really just symbolic.
Yeah, to a large extent. I think, for that basic reason that, the Soviet Union did have to engage in diplomacy. And sort of through the 1920s, there's kind of a dual track where the Soviet state is trying to win some kind of diplomatic, inclusion into the world. And the Communist International, which happens to be led by a selection of the same, human beings, is genuinely, trying to, not foment revolution in the police sense, right? Not, setting day X for revolution, although they did that in Germany in 1923, which was a huge mistake. But, trying to build up the potential for a revolutionary working class movement. But from, as you get later into the 1920s and into the 1930s, into the period, of Stalinism, there's an increasing sort of primacy of Soviet foreign policy over, the revolutionary mission of the Communist International. And sort of this with the concept of socialism in one country, in the sense that the Soviet Union not only does not need, can't afford to wait for revolution anywhere.
I gotta say, this does kind of seem to rhyme with the earlier split we saw in the SDP and with the Austrian Social Democrats. This split between short-term economic development and a more long-term revolutionary mission.
Yeah, there's definitely a homology there.
I think that talking about the ways that the Comintern was unable to materially support socialism, I think the best place to look, because it really was just such a horrible loss, would be the destruction of the Hungarian Soviet Republic in 1920, which I think was a lot more brutal than the destruction of the German Revolution. You saw a joint army of the Kingdom of Romania and some anti-socialist forces from within Hungary ended up taking power of Budapest, and there were immediate reprisals. Due to the widespread belief in anti-Semitic conspiracies, everyday Jewish people were blamed for the revolution and were gunned down in the streets. We made a little mistake in our last episode. We described Miklos Horthy as a general. Our Hungarian friend Kenneth pointed out that he was actually an admiral, which is kind of sad and ironic in a really awful way, because Hungary was now a country without a navy. So I guess if you're an admiral in a landlocked country, all that's left for you to do is to commit horrible ethnic atrocities. And basically just the world, and especially the Comintern, watched helpless as Horthy would allow this to happen and take power. At this time, actually, Hemingway, of all people, wrote a short story about the experiences of an imaginary Hungarian communist escaping Horthy's forces, who goes around spreading the word of revolution, but nobody believes him until he's eventually arrested by police in the West.
That is actually a pretty common historical experience, because after the defeat of the Hungarian Revolution, any Hungarian communist cadre who managed to survive, flee to the Soviet Union. And they would actually become, if not the largest necessarily in a statistical sense, I don't think I've ever seen a historian go through the statistics, but at least most notoriously, the Comintern functionaries were all Hungarians. And Bela Kun managed to survive, and he escaped to the Soviet Union. And he became, a leading official of the Communist International in, a close personal political relationship with Zinoviev. And there was a German communist leader named Paul Levy, who was a close comrade of Rosa Luxemburg. It's not really clear what the reference here is. It could just be to sort of like the general easternness of Hungary, or it could have to do with the fact that Bela Kun also fought in Central Asia. But he referred very disdainfully to these Hungarian Comintern officials as the Turkistanis. And he believed that, they didn't understand Western conditions, and they were always, going about things, the wrong way. And there's a strong argument to be made. The two failed communist insurrections in Germany after the period that we've been talking about, so in the so-called March Action in 1921, which very much was, Bela Kun's political baby, because it was based on an idea called the theory of the offensive that he had sort of theorized, which is that communist strategy consists of always being on the offensive. And I don't think it's difficult to figure out what the flaws in that are, because the conditions to be on the offensive do not automatically exist. And they didn't in Germany in the spring of 1921. And so they started an insurrection that failed brutally. And then again, in November 1923, there was also an attempt to foment a German revolution. At that point, or a German insurrection specifically, the decisive moment. And that time they retreated from armed struggle at the last moment. But they had gone far enough that the party was banned and suppressed and lost, hundreds of thousands of people left the party in disgrace. And some have argued that there was pressure within the structures of the Comintern to do this, not just because of the general project, but because there was this group of Hungarians in the Comintern structure who were, basically their lesson was that you can never lose again. right? And so they became sort of the most like fanatical, operatives of the Communist International. And I think that's at least partly true. You also have to look at Zinoviev and the relationship between different factions in the Russian party. But yeah, and then sort of one final legacy is that there was one prominent Hungarian communist militant who survived and who did not flee. It was a man named Matyas Rákosi, and he would be in prison from the defeat of the revolution until a prisoner exchange in 1940. And he became, after the Second World War, he became one of the most, brutal Stalinist leaders in Eastern Europe. And without wanting to either excuse or psychoanalyze, I think probably 20 years in Miklos Horthy's dungeons, had played a role in, hardening him a bit.
Wow. Well, that's just really incredible context, Brendan. And I think that I really appreciate it. And I think just to close off here, you've talked a lot. You made a really good point here about the fact that there was this big push in the Comintern period to really globalize the communist movement and to make sure that the revolution would not be simply a revolution of white-skinned peoples, in the words of Zinoviev, and against the best wishes of that German asshole Paul Levy, it does seem like there was a lot of support for Asian, for working class movements really across the entire continent of Asia. And I think what's really important here, which I think plays an important role in explaining this strategically, is the fact that by the early 1920s, with the defeats of revolutionary movements in Europe, as well as the success of nationalist movements in the Baltics, you see a situation where the Soviet Union is completely cut off diplomatically, economically, even geographically from the West. If you look geographically, the only port that the Soviet Union has to connect with the West in 1925 or so is St. Petersburg on the Baltic. The rest of the Baltic, which primarily was majority Russian, because Finland, the Baltic states, and Poland, Congress Poland, were part of the Russian Empire. All of those Baltic ports were gone. Just St. Petersburg, and the navies hostile to Russia, most prominently the British and even the Germans, were able to basically patrol that water route and blockade the Soviets whenever they should so choose. On the other hand, in the East, in Central and Northern Asia, you see a much greater success of communist movements. And you also see the only permanent communist successes of the 1920s outside the USSR. The first one I guess we should mention is that there was a failed anti-Russian revolt known as the Basmachi. Way too much to get into for right now. One thing I want to mention, because it's some cool symmetry here, is that one of the strange leaders of the Basmachi was a character named Enver Pasha, who I bet...
Enver Pasha, who is, if you know anything about the Armenian genocide or the final days of the Ottoman Empire, you'll know as one of the three Pashas and one of the driving forces behind the genocide.
Yeah, this guy Enver Pasha would jump onto this anti-Soviet revolution of Central Asian Muslims and try to turn it into this broader Turkic nationalist project. It would fail. He would be killed in a suicidal cavalry charge.
By the Red Army. Sorry, there's rumors that he was killed by an Armenian soldier, but I don't know if there's actually any truth to that. If that were true, that would mean all three Pashas were killed by Armenians, but...
I do actually want to say something about that. So, as much as I was praising the speech that Zinoviev gave at the Hala conference, he does also talk about Enver Pasha, because before he became the leader of the Basmachi, he was sort of flirting with allying with the Soviets.
Yeah, the Soviets had a strange relationship with Ataturk and the Turkish revolutionaries.
Yeah, he was at the Baku Congress, I don't remember if it was Martov or it was the, faction of the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany who didn't want to join the Comintern, but somebody brought this up, and they say, how can you be palling around with this person who committed this horrible atrocity, which connects back to what you said about, Liebknecht, because clearly this is something that German socialists were concerned with. And Zinoviev kind of brushes it off. He says, he basically says that, you can't moralize about, the terrible Enver Pasha. We know what this man has done, and we don't make excuses for it. But this was a conference of, people fighting imperialism and so on. Like I don't think he gives an especially effective answer to why they were, allying with this genocidaire. But then, yeah, of course, Enver Pasha then decided that he had he had other plans as well.
Well, I guess that kind of points to the broader trend of early 1920s communist politics, where you see the seeds of both the successes of working class movements globally, as well as some of their worst mistakes and atrocities. I mentioned the Enver Pasha part here. It's just a kind of cool symmetry with the fact that, you could argue that so much of this begins with Liebknecht being expelled from the party and working with Luxembourg to create his own, which happens because of the Armenian genocide. And here you have the most important architect of the genocide being killed by the communist movement. Moving away from Central Asia into more Northern Asia, there were two successful communist revolutions that would become the only other communist states in this period. Mongolia, which was a total crazy situation. A lot of our listeners probably know this one character who was prominent here, the Baron Ungern von Sternberg. We don't have to get into all the details, but he was this genuinely nutty white Russian emigre of Baltic German descent. Yeah, they're a wacky bunch. And he had some dreams of creating a new khanate. He put the first Khan on the throne since the 18th century. But in this case, together, joint forces of the Russian Red Army, as well as local Mongolian working class movements, overthrew the Mad Baron, as they called him, and established a new Soviet Mongolian Republic. The leader of the Mongolian communists was a guy named Sukbatar, whose name means axe hero. Incredibly cool. He would die under sort of mysterious circumstances very soon after the revolution, and the capital city of Mongolia, Ugra, would be renamed as Ulaanbaatar, which I didn't realize was after this hero. And that's, so Sukbatar means axe hero, Ulaanbaatar means red hero, which, another kind of more poetic nickname. But in addition to Mongolia, in nearby Tuva, remains of Sternberg's army tried to occupy this Turkic-speaking part of Siberia. This time, the same thing happened. Red Army advisors, including a lot of Trotsky's closest advisors, worked with local Tuvan people to oust the whites, and they created the Tuvan People's Republic, which would be this short-lived, very small, independent socialist state on the border between China and the Soviet Union. What's interesting is that this was a case where they were an independent state that tried a few times to join the USSR, because they probably would have a much greater access to resources if they had direct connections with the Soviet economy. But they actually were not allowed, or they were not admitted into the USSR until the war itself, until World War II broke out, which is a funny little anecdote.
I believe the Mongolians also tried to join the USSR.
They might have. As far as I can tell, the concern was that the Soviets wanted to show that they had allies. So initially there was this plan to incorporate all potential revolutionary states into a broader global Soviet Union. But by Stalin's period, with the policy of socialism in one country, that was no longer part of the plan. And I think out of fear of being seen as aggressors, they wanted independent socialist republics to remain independent, which I guess probably connects to a broader outlook of the conflict.
If I'm not mistaken, that independent Tuvan socialist state was the first modern state to have a woman head of state who was not a queen.
Yeah, that's right. In 1940, a woman named Kertek Anshima became the head of Tanu Tuva, the Tuvan Republic. And I think that what this all points to is with the situation of the middle 1920s, where the USSR is cut off economically, diplomatically, and geographically from Europe, but has these long borders with both India and China due to the defeat of the Basmachi in Central Asia, as well as the success of communists in Mongolia and Tuva, sort of points to the more Asian-focusing tenor of global communist politics in the second half of the 20th century. And I think that the fact that these permanent borders would exist not with Germany, not with Italy, but with India and China and Mongolia, I think is quite important to the way that socialist ideas and the direction that ideas will be distributed in under the auspices of the Comintern.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. And you can see actually something foreshadowing it in the notes that Lenin wrote during his illness. He actually talks somewhere about, the central importance of the East in the future and how the day was only dawning, or something like this, that would see, the decisive and final struggle of the peoples of the East for their liberation. So Lenin, at the end of his life, has this very strong intuition about the future direction of the world revolutionary process. And you can see that playing out basically down to the victory in Vietnam in 1975.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess that really is, it's such a basic lesson, but it's a lesson that so many socialists, especially in this period, didn't want to really learn, was the fact that socialism was necessarily a global project. And that if capitalism is a global world system, then it can only be overturned through a genuinely global process, which means the majority of people involved are not going to be Europeans. But it really wasn't until the second half of the 20th century, it seems like, that this was universally acknowledged by socialist and communist movements.
I really do think that the Comintern is one of the central institutions for understanding the 20th century, and not even just the period that it existed. For reference, for listeners, the Communist International would be substantially mothballed by the time World War II broke out, but formally dissolved in 1943, basically because by that time the Red Army had become a much more important instrument of Soviet foreign policy than the Communist International could hope to be, and also as a gesture of goodwill from Stalin to the Western Allies. Right? We talked about that specter of the Comintern, right? And Stalin during World War II had to finally exercise that in order to have a close alliance with the British and the Americans. But things that the Comintern does have effects, I would say, down to down to the defeat of apartheid in South Africa, because the communists, play a crucial role in that, and the Communist Party of South Africa was formed in the crucible of the Comintern. I mentioned way back at the beginning of the episode the role of the communists in anti-racist struggles in the United States, and it was the Comintern that forced American communists to take that seriously, or rather, it was an alliance between the small group of black communists and the International itself that forced the white majority of communists to take that issue seriously. And so that happens in the late 1920s, and it has reverberations, I would say, through the rest of the 20th century history of the United States.
Yeah, I guess it would eventually abandon this, but I know that the Comintern at one point argued that there should be independence for an African-American nation within the U.S. borders.
What they argued was that black people, by the Marxist-Leninist definition of a nation or a nationality, that black people in the United States met that criteria.
And thus needed national self-determination. And they are a nation, like, in that sense. Absolutely. Obviously.
Sure, yeah. If you're considering Russian Jewish people and the Roma to be nations, then I think that African Americans absolutely fit the bill.
Yeah, and that the South was the national homeland of the Afro-American people, and that they should have the right to autonomous political power, that they should have the land, and that they should be able to choose to leave the United States if that was the choice of, the black masses. And that would be the position of the CPUSA quite strongly during the early 1930s, be downplayed somewhat in the later 30s. It would be revived at the height of the Cold War as the party sort of moves to the left, and then it would finally be abandoned by the CPUSA in 1959. But it would be revived by left groups in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. Not that any of those groups ever achieved a huge degree of influence, but it is a concept that has a long legacy in the Black liberation movement and in the left in the United States.
No, I believe there are a handful of groups that still advocate in the U.S. for self-determination for the Black Belt. So yeah.
Yeah. Freedom Road Socialist Organization still has the Black Belt notion, and then I think PSL says black people are a nationality. And there's an element to it. It's complicated, but I think there is a profound distinctiveness within the context of American society that it's not nonsense.
I think that as far as nations are a thing that exists, I think that any definition would include Black Americans as a nation.
So I think there are a number of paths that are taken in the period of the Communist International that would have long-standing consequences for political and social struggle in places all around the world. And we talked about this process of sort of involution of the Russian revolutionary project, the Soviet revolutionary project, the Communist International progressively becoming subject to the imperatives of Soviet foreign policy. And so by the 1930s, you have people trying to form a fourth international. Unfortunately, it was impossible to form a new international in a period of recession for the world revolution. And so the Fourth International never achieved the support of more than a handful of people outside of, oddly, the tin mines of Bolivia and the tea plantations of Sri Lanka. But that's, the history of Trotskyism is a different story. And then I think it's interesting to look at the second half of the 20th century, where you have this progressive disaggregation of the communist movement, right? You have the split between, as soon as communists have power in more than one country, it starts to fragment. Yugoslavia splits with the Soviets in 1948. China and the Soviet Union have their epic split. And then you have in the 1960s and 70s, I think that, the period from 1968 to 1973 is the closest equivalent to that period of 1919, where world revolution becomes something that is, not just a phrase, but that feels like a vivid possibility.
Sure, yeah. No, you've got the Black Panthers in the U.S., the 1968 in Mexico and France.
Many reactionaries certainly felt that it was around the corner and were terrified of it.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that it's also real for Nixon. And you sort of have like a Cuban attempt to create what looks like kind of a third world revolutionary international in the form of, OSPAL in the 1960s. But then it doesn't really turn into that, and it becomes more of a propaganda element, and Cuba becomes, more aligned with the USSR. And, there are still conferences and meetings of international communist parties later in the century, but basically, and where I would conclude, is that even though, the international communist movement to some extent continues to exist, and even though there are attempts to create a new, revolutionary international, there would never be anything like, the early Comintern in terms of a functioning, for all of the political mistakes that it made and the weaknesses that it had, that we've been discussing, but a real attempt to have a functional leadership for, the world revolution. And that's sort of what I think makes the Comintern, historically unique compared to the period before its existence and the period after it dissolves.
Thank you so much for that. And while we have you here, with one last quick question, we've talked about what the concept of a worker Soviet meant for these people in this period in the 1920s. However, just like in Germany and in Austria, the period where the Soviets would have power would not last. Could you concisely describe why the Soviet councils would eventually lose power in the Soviet Union that bore their name, and what kind of implications you think this would have?
Sure, okay. So the central reason that Soviet power, and especially Soviet democracy in the direct functional sense, does not last in revolutionary Russia is because the economic conditions, first the economic conditions and then the political conditions of the Civil War period effectively make it impossible. The Russian working class, which, in 1917 came as close to any group of real people ever have to the ideal in Marxist theory of what the working class is supposed to do, begins to progressively disaggregate as you get into 1918, because the country's economy collapses. When Russia pulls out of the war, the defense spending, as we would now call it, that was propping up industrial production in Russia, bottoms out. And all the structural problems that help create the conditions for the revolution in the first place become, aggravated by the day. And so factories are being shut down, or people are essentially being paid to do nothing. The price of food is going through the roof. There's no fuel to run the factories. There's no coal to heat people's homes. And so millions of people return to their home villages in the countryside. At the same time, the political situation is heating up. The Civil War begins. The most militant workers are moving into party positions, into state positions. And initially, that's not a bureaucratizing mechanism in a negative sense. Initially, that's, dedicated working class militants, volunteering to do difficult and dangerous things. But it means it's another element of this process of, the capital R, capital P revolutionary proletariat in Russia begins to disintegrate into revolutionary militants and people trying to survive. And in that context, and especially in the context of the Civil War itself, which, imprints as all war does, a centralized character to every institution, right? There's this progressive militarization of all aspects of life within the, embattled revolutionary outpost in part of Russia, and then progressively, they take over more of the country. And so you have the party taking over positions from the state, you have functions from the state, you have centralized state institutions taking over functions from the Soviet. And that's essentially complete by about 1920. But what I just want to emphasize that, contrary to what some interpretations from whether right or left that are very, very critical of the Bolsheviks would say, there was not, a Bolshevik plan to eviscerate the Soviets and take all power for themselves. The party state that exists by 1921 is not what the Bolsheviks intended to create when they came to power. It's the result of a series of ad hoc decisions that eventually have, these harmful consequences. And some of them may have been unavoidable, and some of them were recognized as being mistakes, and some of them were recognized as being both mistakes and unavoidable at the same time. And there are debates within the Bolshevik Party, about the details of all these decisions as they're made. But yeah, that's basically, yeah. So by about 1920, 21, the Soviets are no longer, functional institutions, and it essentially, it becomes a synonym for anything that's not directly, like Soviet institutions in the USSR means, government institutions that are not directly part of the party.
And I think it's what's so interesting and also honestly so frustrating about this particular moment in time is that it seems so obvious that the subsumption of these Soviets into the bureaucratic apparatus was a huge mistake, which with very long-term implications, you could argue, on the course of the Soviet government. But nobody seemed to realize this at the time, that this was a moment where the specific actions made sense in their context. And I think that's kind of sobering, that, sometimes what seems like the right call might have effects far beyond our own reckoning, or sometimes the fact that the Soviets pinned so much of their hopes on the success of revolutionary movements abroad when these revolutionary movements would not take root in the places they expected. And I think that this all goes to show that although maybe we can learn something from the history of these past mistakes, I think if anything, what it tells us is that you often can't tell that history is happening while you're living it, and that you can't even know what's going to happen or what even has happened until years later.
And I think that's a great place to end.
So yeah, well, thank you so much, Brendan Yukon Cornelius, for coming on. Really nice of you to lend your time. This was a great one.
Yes, thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah, this was very fun.
And it's a great way to really begin in earnest this series on interwar politics. We're still lucky to have you, and we hope you have a great night. And yeah, thanks so much to everyone for listening.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.